Although unrelated to any case for or against the resurrection of Jesus, an argument made by critics against it is that the Jewish faith stole the idea of bodily resurrection from the Zoroastrian religion. It's supposed that the Jews received this idea from the Zoroastrians while under Persian domination, around the time of Daniel. But what's the earliest evidence for the concept of resurrection in Zoroastrian sources? To make a case that the Jewish faith borrowed its concept of resurrection from Zoroastrian sources requires some indication that those Zoroastrian sources predate the earliest Jewish sources that teach resurrection. But if we went by the dates of religious texts alone, we would have to assume that the theft occurred in the opposite direction, if it occurred at all. One scholar sums up the matter this way. Beyond the summary, what can be said in terms of hard evidence for dating the Zoroastrian doctrine of resurrection? The earliest manuscripts of the Avesta, the Zoroastrian document that teaches resurrection, are dated well after the start of the Christian era, to as late as the 10th century AD. And the earliest it is supposed that the Avesta was put into writing was around 360 AD. To support the thesis that the Jews were the borrowers, it must be argued that the contents of the Avesta somehow reflect earlier traditions. Critics may suggest that there are archaic features in the Avesta that point to an earlier date. But if this is the argument, there's an inconsistency, for the same critics will often just as readily date books like Daniel and Ezekiel very late. And when confronted with replies that point to archaic features in those books, they'll retort that these must be isolated snippets of archaic material preserved inside a collection of much later material. Using standard tests of authentication, is there any evidence for an early date for the Avesta? There are two supposed references to the Avesta in existence at an early date. The first is a story which claims that Alexander the Great destroyed most of the Avesta and persecuted Zoroastrian priests. This, however, is an extremely late legend which first appears in a 9th century book, 1200 years after the time of Alexander. It also doesn't correspond with historical sources that indicate that Alexander treated the Persian culture with respect. One other reputed secular testimony of the Avesta is said to come from the Latin author Pliny, who in his Natural History writes the following. But it's not clear whether Pliny is talking about the Avesta or some other literature that went under the name of Zoroaster, which was very common at the time. Now, how about internal evidence of content? Is there anything within the Avesta that points to an earlier date for it? None at all. As one scholar has written, the Avesta also names several people who lived between the dates of 250 and 400 AD. Since contemporary cross-references are a fundamental part of dating a document, this is a matter of some difficulty for those who would date the Avesta traditions early. The key document of the Zoroastrian religion thus provides no evidence of Jewish theft of the concept of resurrection. Next up, we'll have a look at claims that some other authors attest to an early Zoroastrian belief in resurrection. See you then!